Hello, welcome to the church. We're incredibly excited about what you're about to hear, even though I have no idea what they're going to talk about. But I'm sure it'll be exciting. And before I introduce our guests, I'd like you to turn your phones off. And having done that, let me begin with the intro. And normally I shoot from the hip on this, but this is too big. So I wrote it down, so I'm going to shoot from the piece of paper. We're deeply honored and enriched to have Sally Susman among the citizens of our community, and more personally important to me, as a founding member on our board here at the church. I can't tell you how important her role has been to us. She gave us credibility when April and my vague and fanciful concept for this place as an art center could be as a significant contributor to the life of the village was just simply that, a fantasy. Sally joined us while we were in the throes of the pandemic, and we had to delay our opening and limped along trying to stay afloat. Sally was a calming and leveling force, helping us to figure out short and long-term solutions to our goals. She knew, working on the inside where the battle was raging, that COVID would become normalized in a way that the public would once again be able to socialize. Sally's career has straddled both governmental and corporate affairs at the highest levels of engagement and impact. She spent time in Washington as a legislative assistant at the Senate, executive legislative assistant, improvement affairs, intergovernment affairs at the Department of Commerce, constantly seeking roles that would give her longer and longer titles. She went to work at the American Express as a vice president of European communications and corporate affairs, falling just one short of a word to beat the one before. And then in 2000, she joined Estee Lauder as executive vice president of global communications. 2007, she joined Pfizer in the role of chief corporate affairs officer, where she finally did something meaningful. Things to note about Sally. She is from St. Louis, where I have roots as well, through my mother's side. Her father was a successful lawyer, investment banker, and also appointed ambassador to the UK by President Obama. I'm imagining that the skill sets her father had were the dominant genes that got passed on to her. She is one of only 20 chief corporate affairs officers in Fortune 100 companies. It's a position that has become increasingly important to the multinational corporations as they have expanded deeper into cultures and markets that have such a great diversity of histories and ranges of values. I can't even imagine the complexity of navigating those issues. I'm sure today we'll get a peek into how Sally's skill set actually has come to play in dealing with it. We're also honored to have Margaret Hoover with us, who will be the interviewer. I'm sure you all know Margaret from her roles on CNN and also Bill Riley's O'Reilly Factor. She was also part of the Bush administration, doing a lot of what Sally does, which is deal with affairs of state, right? So we have an amazing opportunity here to listen to two extraordinary and successful neighbors who are imbued with a high purpose, clear moral vision, deep compassion for, and who are great communicators. So this better be good. Please welcome Sally and Margaret.
I was only partly joking when I said this was a roast, but then you really went there. Thank you, Eric. I am going to start. You all know that this is a hometown crowd here for Sally Susman, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, including, I just saw sneak in the back, a friend from the Bush administration, who is also part of Sally's world at Pfizer, Raul Damas. Are you still here? Great. So there, it's all true. This is a moment to celebrate a friend and a mentor for me, who has written an excellent book that is a Wall Street Journal bestseller. Breaking Through, Communicating to Open Minds, Move Hearts, and Change the World. You have done all three of those things. And I know that this place is a very meaningful place to you, both here in the church and also here in Sag Harbor. And it's the place where you wrote the book. It's the place where I know you consider it a spiritual home, and I know you probably want to start by recognizing a few people.
I do, Margaret, thank you. And I just might add to Eric's unique introduction that you are also the host of Firing Line on PBS. That somehow got forgotten. And I'm way out of my league here because I know just this very week that you interviewed Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Hillary Clinton, and you're just slumming it for me today. So I really appreciate that. I also do want to thank you, Eric and April and Sherry and Telena and everybody at this church who made this a spectacularly important, soulful community center for all of us who care about arts and writing and literature, and there's nowhere that would be a greater honor to speak than here. And while I'm rolling, I also must thank Patty McCormick, Julie Ligstein, and Lisa Sherman, my great friends who are throwing a beautiful party for you after this, downstairs and outside, and who have walked every mile of this journey along with me. So I could actually probably thank 95% of the people in the room, and the 5 I haven't met, thanks for coming. But I will subject and submit myself now to your interrogation.
Yeah. All right. You haven't seen the questions, just so everybody knows. And there will be a moment at the end for those of you, if you have questions along the way, there will be a short Q&A, so get your questions ready. Eric left out that you're the Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Pfizer. You're also the head of the Pfizer Foundation and co-chair of Pfizer's Political Action Committee. And the tagline of the book, because we all know for every book there's a tagline. And as I read the book and have sort of internalized it, it strikes me that, you know, the theme of the book is that communications is no longer a soft skill. It's this thing you say, you call it a rock hard competency. When did that change?
I think it's always been true, but it's become far more intense. And somewhere in that introduction that Eric mentioned, I have worked for 9 CEOs, cabinet secretaries, and senators, and they're all really smart and they're hardworking. Nobody falls into the corner office. They got there because they had a drive. But in my studying of them, the ones that really broke through and became game-changing were those that appreciated communications as a rock-hard competency, as important to what they do as sales, manufacturing, finance. So I think about Ken Chenault, who's also a Sag Harbor neighbor, and his leadership after 9/11 and how he articulated hope and optimism for our world. I think about our friend Leonard Lauder, who, built a small company into a global enterprise with thank you notes and storytelling. And of course, I think of Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, who really led the company to have the vaccine.
You talk in your book about sort of these power tools of communication. And there are several, and you have really practical advice about all of them, but you also personalize it. So I want to pick out a couple and then have you talk through them. You say, channel your intentions, muster the courage for candor, stay curious, be creative, perfect your pitch. Let's take the first one. Muster the courage for candor. It's Pride Month, almost.
Yes.
And you and I chatted about how this is a business book with a coming out story.
It's a business book, but it's very personal, and I share a lot of mistakes that I made. Before I turned my manuscript in, I asked my mom to read it, and she said, it's not a business book, it's a memoir. There's a lot of me in it, and the story that Margaret is referring to is, I believe very much in the power of candor and how important it is. So in the early 80s, I was just starting my life, having graduated from college, and I realized at that point that I'm gay. And I knew I needed to go to St. Louis and tell my parents this information. And some of you in this room know my parents, and they are wonderful people, but this was a really tough conversation. And as I prepared for it, it wasn't a question of whether or not it would be bad. It was a question of how bad is this going to be. And it was bad. My mom was angry, my dad cried, and he said to me, you will never have a spouse, children, or a career. And he said those things not to hurt me, though they did. That was his parental fear talking at the time. And remember, this was 40 years ago, which is like 100 years in gay time. And, I realized in the crystallization of that moment, in the cauldron of the candor, that I suddenly had a life plan. That if I did nothing else in my life, I would have 3 things. And my wonderful wife of 35 years, Robin, is here in the front row. And she doubles as an editor-in-chief, too. Our daughter, Lily, 29, is traveling around Asia, and I couldn't be prouder of the work that I do. So the lesson in it was, if you have something you need to say, anything, if it's an apology that you haven't extended because you fear the hurt is too deep, or a love letter that's stuck in your draft file for fear of rejection, or an outreached hand to an estranged family member that you think the divide is too deep, my argument is have the courage.
One of the things you wrote in that section of the book that I found so compelling, and it really opened my mind to how being gay was so fundamental to your communication strategy. You said coming out is a lifelong communications exercise. Like, the work is never done.
Never.
You write, quote, the work is never complete. There is always a new neighbor who's just moved next door, the boss at a new job, the teacher at your kid's school. Talk more about that.
Well, it's a never-ending communications exercise where you try to do it in a way that is warm and comfortable. I'm actually thinking of the Ronald Lauder story, if I could do that. Okay, and Ronald and Joe Carroll wanted to be here today, but they couldn't get here. But he knows the story, and we both love it, which is when I went to interview for the job at the Lauder companies, I'd had about 10 interviews. I was absolutely out of clothes. I had not another thing to wear in my closet. I really wanted this job. And I was still coming out. I hadn't intended to live in the closet, but nor was I at a place in my life where this would be like the first thing I talked about in a job interview. So I go see Ronald. His office has museum quality art in it. It's all very beautiful and formal. I sit down and he said, and his assistant runs in and says, "Mr. Lauder, the Prime Minister of Israel is on the phone." And so I offered, oh, I'm sorry. No, I screwed that up. The first thing he said to me was, "What does your husband do?" And I know that's not HR correct these days, but again, this was also a long time ago, and I do wear this little gold band. After he asked the question, the assistant runs in, says he's got this phone call from the Prime Minister. I offer to give him the privacy of his office, and he says, "No, you sit here. I'll be back." And he came back 10 minutes later. I thought it was like 10 hours for me as I sat there and sweated, thinking, what was I going to do and what was I going to say? And when he sat back down, I could see in his eyes, he'd forgotten the question. You know, he had moved on. But for me, I hadn't forgotten the question or the importance of the moment and the role that being truthful plays in building relationships. So I said to him, "Thank you so much for asking about my family. I have a wonderful partner, and she and I," this was before marriage, so a wonderful partner, and she and I are raising a beautiful daughter, and because of her, I feel more supported and more able to really commit myself to my work. And he just stopped, and I'm thinking, just take your purse and walk out the back, it will be fine. And he said, "You will make a fantastic spokesperson for our company," and offered me the job on the spot. Wow.
Another one of your power tools for communication is about pitch. Perfect your pitch. You give a lot of examples of how to do this as a communicator, but you also, in describing perfect pitch, use Justice Potter from the Supreme Court's 1964 decision when he defines pornography. You know it when you see it.
And pitch, you know it when you hear it. So I want to make clear that I'm not talking about the dreaded elevator pitch, you know, where you have to tell your whole life story in 30 seconds. And I'm not talking about a cold call, you know, people, telemarketers pitching you. I'm talking about something that I feel is much deeper and nuanced and rich in the concept of leadership. And that is the ability to strike the right moment, to rise to the right moment. And I thought a lot about Ken Chenault, who I mentioned earlier, and who's a wonderful member of this community. And it was after 9/11. Ken had been CEO only for a couple of months. His business as a global payment system was crashing. His headquarters was shut down because they're right next door to Ground Zero. And Ken knew instinctively that he needed to get people together in a room. So he rented out Madison Square Garden and invited the 5,000 people who worked at American Express to hear from him. He walked in and threw away the speech that had been written for him by somebody like me. And he spoke from the heart. He gave hugs. He reached out to people he knew had been impacted personally. But the most important thing that he did was he made clear that American Express's best days are ahead of it, because leadership is the purveying of hope and optimism, and that is pitch perfect.
You talk about humility a lot, and you also communicate that in your affect and sort of in everything you do. All your friends know that. This room can see that. How is humility a power tool in communications?
Well, first of all, I feel very humble at this moment. I mean, this moment is a lifelong dream come true for me. I really never thought I would have this moment, and I'm grateful to all of you. I think you get a bestseller by having a lot of best friends who help you out. But a lesson that I learned in humility, I tell the story actually of Leonard Lauder, Ronald's brother, and he was my boss at Estee Lauder. And when I first joined the company, I had zero experience in the beauty business, none. And he took me by the hand and introduced me to all of the beauty editors in the publishing houses. And one editor in particular, who will remain nameless, was very rude to him and made us wait, had us stand outside her desk while she was seated, kind of barely looked up, gave us short shrift, and we're out the door. And as we're leaving, Leonard said to me, "Now, don't forget to write her a thank you note." And I thought, what? You know, she was terrible. He said, "No, it's what we do. You know, we leave people with a good feeling. We make sure they know we appreciate them. We express our gratitude to them." And that is why that became a thing for me. And I so admired that this man, who had done so much, would have no hesitation to continually thank people and be tremendously humble.
You have these tools that you've developed. We've talked about some of them. You had, and the world had this moment in 2020 when they came to the forefront in your life and your career. And so I think I definitely have so many questions about the pandemic that I feel like I can ask you in front of 100 people that I haven't asked you in private.
And a former Pfizer board member.
Great, here we go. So what happened? Let's go behind the scenes. I'd really love to understand what it was like to be, let's place this. It's March 2020, the economy shuts down. Sally and I, and maybe many of you in this room, flee to here, or are here. And your CEO is in Greece for a meeting. He's Greek, and he's Greek-American, and he's in Greece for a meeting, and he gets stuck there. Take it from there.
Okay. So Albert Bourla is Pfizer's CEO, my boss and friend, and in March of 2020, and as Margaret says, let's go back, I was really scared for my family, for our community, for our world. Albert flies to Greece to give a speech, and by the time he lands, the conference he went to attend had shut down. So he has to turn right around and come back, and he writes on a piece of paper that he has to do 3 things. The first is take care of our 85,000 employees around the world, which many companies had to do at the time. Second, to make sure the steady stream of medicine continued to flow, because cancer didn't take a break during the pandemic, or any other horrible disease. And the third thing he wrote on his little note, which we have at the office, is, and we have to get a vaccine in 8 months. And that's
by the end of the year.
By the end of the year, which was a vaccine by the end of the year. And then I thought, oh no, it's a worldwide global pandemic, and my boss has lost his mind. Because that's a 12-year proposition, not an 8-month proposition. But then I saw Albert do something that I've never seen any other CEO do when there's a big, thorny, amazing problem. He looked around for a project manager and appointed himself. And that's when I thought, well, maybe, just maybe, we're gonna do this. And we set about working in a way like we've never worked before, taking a linear process and doing everything at the same time, manufacturing vaccines before we knew if they worked, buying raw materials before we were certain what we would need, taking clinical trials that usually take 3 years to fill, and the team said, we can do it in 3 months, and Albert says, you have 3 weeks. I mean, it was just this press of time. At the same time, I'm here taking refuge in Sag Harbor, and I'm actually in a downward dog at home, when I think, if he's got this big intention, I need a big intention too. And so I thought we needed to take this time to change the reputation of Big Pharma and Pfizer. When I left the Estee Lauder companies, people thought I was crazy to leave a beloved company for one that nobody liked. And I spent the first 10, 12 years at Pfizer beating my head against that wall. But when the pandemic hit, I thought this is the moment to change minds, move hearts. So we did things dramatically different, Margaret. We put all of our intellectual property, our treasured secrets, up on our website. I embedded media into the company so that we would be able to tell the story. Many sleepless nights thinking that I was filming the greatest corporate debacle of the world. But today, Pfizer is a top 10 global brand because of what we did and how we did it and how we told the story. So just to quick summarize, there were 3 transformations during the pandemic. There was a science transformation, because mRNA technology is going to change drug development forever. There was a trust and reputation transformation for a company, and there was a personal transformation for those of us who were involved and had the pressure of, the privilege of the pressure, and to work like that and feel like we could make a difference. And it was during this very busy time, walking the streets of John Street and Bluff Point Road, that I thought about all this and wrote the book.
So what was it? I mean, how did you, I mean, you had been working on sort of reintroducing your company and a pharmaceutical company, but it's quite rare, frankly, that an industry has a chance to reintroduce itself to society or to bring new value. I mean, this was an inflection point. You know, what was it about sort of that for you chose to capitalize on this moment and go in that direction?
There were a couple of things I think that caused that inflection point. One was our decision to use very different language as a corporation. So we had extra advertising inventory because you couldn't advertise telling people to go see their doctor when they couldn't go see their doctor. So I had some advertising supply and wrote really very different messages like, science will win. Not Pfizer will win, science will win. Or that we were trying to make the impossible possible. And importantly, that the only enemy is the virus, because there was a lot of racism and finger pointing about where COVID came from. So we had a different language, a different vocabulary, a different mindset. And the other thing is that a friend of mine who helped with the recovery after 9/11 called me up early in the pandemic, and he said, the only thing harder than being at the center of a crisis is being on the sidelines of a crisis. And I knew what he meant because every day we were energized, we were motivated to be different. We felt we had a chance to change the trajectory of a disease. You know, maybe, perhaps we might not even be sitting here today like this if not for this chance. So these things created really unique conditions.
I think it's an incredible privilege, like you said, to be in the middle of a company that has the possibility to stem a pandemic. But then there's a major, obvious communication challenge, which is you might get a vaccine, but how are you going to communicate to people that you need to use it?
This was my biggest fear, that we would create a novel vaccine that nobody would take. It came quickly. It used a technology that had never been used before. And it was a deeply divided political time. And so I assumed that I would be successful in convincing people to have confidence because I had 2 things. I had data and I had expertise. I had great data, tremendous clinical trial results, and real-world evidence that came in from Israel and other places. And I had fantastic experts. Michael Dolston is our chief scientist, and we were talking to Dr. Fauci all the time, and all the Dr. Faucis around the world. But in the end, that moved no one. The people who wanted it and were banging down our door to get it still wanted it, and those who said, no way, I'm not taking it, wouldn't take it. And what ended up making the difference was also 2 things. One was emotional, personal storytelling. The grandmother at the senior center who said, oh, I got to see my grandkids because I'm vaccinated. Or the student that got to go back on campus because they were vaccinated. So these personal stories started to become viral. I mean, when before did people take pictures of themselves getting vaccines and posting them on their social media accounts? Never. When did people talk at cocktail parties about being in a clinical trial? Well, we didn't have cocktail parties, but when did people talk to each other about being in clinical trials? Never. So these stories, and then who was the storyteller? Not the celebrity, the politician, the rock star, the sports hero. It was the neighbor, the preacher, the barber, the kid. It was all this sort of unique way of moving opinions.
You write about an experience where you actually have your own friend in your life who had vaccine hesitancy, and how you worked through that with him or her. I don't know that I saw the gender of the person you wrote about, but you also talk about the real choice not to label people who didn't agree with the vaccine or had hesitancy as an anti-vaxxer. So
I never say anti-vaxxer. It is aggressive and othering, and I'm not going to convince anyone by name-calling or twisting of their arms or breaking of their backs. I try rather to ask questions, to listen, to continue to dialogue with people, but the whole, anti-vax thing was a very destructive public discussion.
So against the backdrop of the pandemic and this incredible journey where a vaccine is developed, and now we're 3 years out almost, and we're exactly 3 years out. 6 million people have been saved by this vaccine. When you reflect back, which of your communication tools in those critical 8 months sort of led the way for you?
Well, I would like to maybe pick two. You mentioned pitch, and I think that pitch was very important. Albert has a great pitch. Our scientists have a great pitch. We worked on this idea of befriending the world during its most difficult time, and so I feel the pitch was very important. But so too is the subject of the final chapter, which is the idea of seeking harmony. Because I realized that we were in such a crossfire of constant debate, and that the idea that you have to win every argument is really very sad. And I recently read a survey in the Edelman Trust Barometer that said, they asked people this question: if someone was laying on the ground in front of you and they were hurt, really hurt, would you help them if you thought that probably they didn't agree with you on politics or social issues? 30% said yes, which means an astonishing 70% said no. They would not help another person in need. So what we've been pushing, and where we're sort of trying to take the discussion, is the idea that we need to be able to disagree agreeably, something that is part of your mantra, to be able to talk and debate without having to score every point or win every argument. And this is where I really feel we need to put our efforts, now that the pandemic is behind us. We need to put our efforts towards fighting disinformation, building harmony as a society.
So actually that's perfect for the next question, because I think you're in this position where you're a chief communications officer for a major corporation, and there's a lot of questions right now about whether CEOs in corporations should make it their business to take a stand on social issues or political issues.
A lot of CEOs would answer that hard no, that they don't. In fact, you had a CEO on recently.
Yeah, Barry Diller was on, and he said, absolutely not. It's not the job of, but there are other CEOs who don't. But actually, your book starts with
I'm in the camp that companies do need to weigh in on the public debate.
And tell the story of how Pfizer did that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because that's a very nuanced example.
Sure, thank you. And there's like a question that comes before a big company almost daily about, should we get involved in this, and what about that issue? And last February, when Putin rolled his tanks into Ukraine, most of the good and wonderful best brands out there very visibly pulled out of Russia. Starbucks, McDonald's, Apple. But for Pfizer and any other company that makes medicine, we had a humanitarian exemption. So think about that, if you make medicine, a kid in Russia with cancer is just a kid with cancer and needs his medicine as much as anybody else. So we, like our brethren in the industry, decided we would continue to make our medicine available in Russia. But then we really couldn't sleep well at night. It didn't feel sufficient. So we gathered again as a team and decided that what we should do is donate every penny that we earn in Russia to Ukrainian relief. Because we did not want to be seen as doing business as usual or having a status quo mentality. This is a promise and a pledge that we've kept for the whole time of the hostilities. We've donated over $40 million to Ukrainian relief, and it felt really good to be able to say, life is not a and if then, yes, no kind of thing, that you can have a nuanced discussion. And I actually asked my CEO to go on TV and talk about this, because you not only have to make nuanced decisions, you then have to explain them to the world.
How'd it
Came
go?
on your show too.
How'd it go? I know. It's crazy how I got the booking. Sally, it's an excellent book. It is heartfully written, and it's reflective, and it actually has just core tenets that actually made me reflect on communication style and the power of communication. So obviously highly recommended. I bet all of you have it, and I suspect Sally will be signing books later, but let's open it up to questions for Sally. And I know that you've had time to think about some, and we'll bring a microphone to you.
And Conio's is at the back if you feel the urgent need to buy more copies.
Oh, there are, oh yes, Canio's is at the back, and Sally will sign and personalize a book if you buy it from Canio's here today. And I'm gonna cold call some people pretty soon. Okay, here we go. There are a couple of people who are in the book who are here in the audience, so.
Hi, sorry, that was fabulous. Thank you very much. You sort of had this tagline concept that communications suddenly become hard, and I feel it's become harder since George Floyd's murder. And companies have to take stands, partly because their consumers expect it, and the media expects it, but partly because their employees expect it as well. It seems that there are like mouse brands who hide, and mule brands who dive in. Is there a third way for a company to bridge that divide?
No, it's a great question. Because companies are having to make these decisions, Pfizer is a very metric-driven company. We have a metric for whether we advance a compound on our pipeline. We have a metric for whether an acquisition had a good ROI. We had no metric, to answer your question. And I feared that everybody thought Pfizer does or doesn't do something because of what Sally thinks. And what Sally thinks is definitely not a metric. No, it's not a metric. So I came up with a 5-question framework that we ask before every issue. It's in the book, but I will just quickly run through it. The first question is, how does it relate to our purpose? Pfizer's purpose is breakthroughs that change patients' lives. So we have wide berth to talk about healthcare. But we shouldn't be out talking about everything, because then nobody will listen to you or you lose your agency. Second question is, how does it impact our most important stakeholders? Every organization, every institution has their own set of stakeholders. For us, that's usually patients and employees. The third question to ask is, how does this relate to our values? My company has 4 values: courage, excellence, equity, and trust. No, equity and joy, sorry. Equity and joy. I always forget joy. And so it's not how does it relate to our politics. For example, our recent decision to go against the judge in Texas who said the FDA should not allow people to have the drug for abortion, we immediately came out against the judge and for the FDA. And it's not about abortion. It's not about the politics of abortion. It is about the value of the FDA and the value that the FDA plays in the system. The fourth question is what are our choices here? Because so often people in jobs like mine are terribly reactive. They answer the media call on deadline. They have to sign or not sign the petition. And my point is, take the power back. Write your own letter to your employees and put it on your website. Decide you'll respond in the ways in which feel authentic to you. And then the fifth question is, what is the price of our silence? And that's a question we put into the framework right after the George Floyd murder, because there are some things, racism, violence in the schools, where silence is just deafening.
Another question? Oh, here we go.
So Sally, I heard you describe taking the opportunity to transform the perception of an industry and a company. And I'm curious, now that the dust is settling, how you think that went?
Dr. Cliff Hudis, president of ASCO, and my dear, dear friend. So the thing is that if we don't do anything, Cliff, at this point, our reputation will slide back. The company will not have the spirit and the esprit de corps that it has today. And so we realize we need to do big things that impact lots of people. I'm embarrassed to cite this statistic in front of you because you know this all 10 times better than me, but 1 in 3 people in this country will have a cancer diagnosis in their lifetime. And that means 1 in 3 of us, and all of us will know someone. So we are now putting a big emphasis on cancer and trying to use the same skill sets that we did for the vaccine, partner with a high-tech, with a company with the technology, put the full force of the company behind it, and keep people motivated on breakthroughs. That's our plan.
Hey, what a treasure. I really appreciate and salute the ideas you've been presenting. I just had a quick question that I wanted to bounce off of you about the role of the partnerships that helped enable mRNA. Obviously, the public and governmental sectors had to synchronize with the corporations in such a way that one could argue that one of the legacies of the Trump administration, which, depending on your perspective, remember he said inject bleach and things like that. These kinds of issues could be, I think, even made more robust because regretfully, if you look at what's going on with DeSantis in Florida with Disney or these kind of issues where the tension between corporate versus government, I'd love to hear your perspective on that because at the moment it seems obviously we're in the eye of the storm heading into the election and misinformation and the notions of governance and then corporate responsibility have kind of gone into this strange dimension right now. And there's thought leaders like Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia, for example, or even Peter Iger at Disney, which was the way he's fighting back against DeSantis. Just kind of a bird's eye view. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I would love to have dinner with you sometime because this is a fascinating discussion and a brilliant question. And I want to just take a minute with it because, people assume, they assume certain political biases or whatever. And I'm thinking back to the fall of 2020, the debate between President Trump and then Vice President Biden. And in the opening comments, President Trump says, I talked to that guy at Pfizer, and he told me we're going to have a vaccine by a very special day in November, making the intimation that we were going to have the vaccine as part of an election strategy. I love politics. I was sitting at home with a big glass of wine and a bowl of popcorn ready to settle in for the night. I spilled my wine, I threw my popcorn, and I started writing a statement from the company saying that we would move at the speed of science. And believe me, when Albert wrote that note on his flight back from Greece, and he said by the end of the year, I assure you we were not thinking about the American election. But it wasn't only President Trump that was doing that. There were people in the Biden campaign who were asking us to go slower. So there was a lot of political crossfire. And, you know, the partnerships were important. Operation Warp Speed did do some real good in terms of bringing the 6 vaccine manufacturers together and helping us to collaborate. Even though we usually have like really sharp elbows, we collaborated in ways we had never done before. Sharing capacity, sharing data, sharing ideas, talking to one another. And so, wait, I wanted to say one other point about that. The collaboration was extraordinary. Oh, the partnerships. So we had a wonderful partner in BioNTech. And you know, BioNTech, and I also want to give credit to Moderna, because Moderna also used mRNA and also moved extremely quickly. For Moderna, it was the first drug they ever made, which is quite a journey in of itself. Pfizer is a 175-year-old company, and there were many days I thought they had the advantage, because they were nimble and new, and we were big and had, you know, problems with bureaucracy. So I had huge respect for Moderna. But what was interesting about the BioNTech-Pfizer partnership, the 2 CEOs spoke regularly. My boss, my wonderful boss, is Jewish and Greek. The CEO of BioNTech is Turkish and Muslim. By all rights, these guys should be fist fighting with each other, but they didn't, and they were like brothers through this process. And I think it speaks to what we do to collaborate when the stakes are enormous. And my argument is, let's do that all the time, not just when we're suffering in a pandemic. And your points about Disney and Bob Iger and Patagonia are all very well made.
Is it?
One more?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, but I was also going to say something for the sake of it, which is the question asker is one of our current artists in residence, Paul D. Miller. That's Paul. And you might see a little bit of a current project of his downstairs during the reception. This is actually a major project, but you'll see that.
I hope you'll be
another
down there,
question.
Paul. Will you be down there, Paul, to answer questions from
We
the
have a few questions, yeah?
We hadn't gotten anyone over here.
Over
with
here?
that. We've been
Sam?
Given that Pfizer is such a large and multinational company and that its value is based a lot on intellectual property, given what we see today in the world, what's your view of China from your seat and where it's headed?
Well, I think that China is actually building a biopharmaceutical industry to rival ours. And, you know, we have our patent protection here, but the future of patent protection is really at risk. People see patents as barriers to access, as the tool of greedy corporations. You know, I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of the importance of protecting our intellectual property, and we have to bring China into the WTO and the other bodies that will encourage them to be good partners in the global biopharmaceutical world. But we have a ton of work to do, and the people in China suffered a lot because China wouldn't let our vaccines come in. Their lockdown was devastating. Their cases are spiking, but they are building a very strong industry, and much of our supply comes from there. So we have to solve our problems globally, and we have to figure a way to have a relationship with China for science, for health.
Oh, we have a lot of questions. I think we have time for 2 more, 1 more.
Sally, what do you think the impact of AI can be on Big Pharma?
No, we were laughing because this is the question I'm getting all the time, and I think the way I'm thinking about AI is there's a win and there's a worry. For healthcare, it's a win. I mean, it will be able to read data more quickly. AI will be able to help us with drug discovery, with clinical readouts, with all kinds of things that we are already running with. But I worry for my profession and our profession that we do together, the profession of communications and, opinion forming and idea making, I worry a lot that issues around truth and trust and, authenticity are a little bit at risk.
I have a question. Sorry, somebody submitted to me anonymously, and I think it's a really relevant one, so I wanted to share it.
Executive director privilege.
Thank you. The question is about either your personal stance or the stance of Pfizer on gender-affirming care, particularly for children and minors.
We're for it.
Anything further you want to say about that?
No, because I think it's a ridiculous issue. I mean, I don't mean to belittle the question, but people using healthcare as a political tool is unacceptable.
All right. Are you ready for a glass of wine?
I'm always ready for a glass of wine, but I do just want to say, maybe if I may, one thing in closing, which is Margaret referenced it at the beginning, and I didn't quite say fully how much this community means to me. You'll see at the back of my book, I acknowledge my Sag Harbor writing sisters who've been incredible. I wanted the house I have because it's next door to John Steinbeck's house, which is now, thanks to many people in this room, a permanent fixture in our community. The value that we place on the arts and writing is really great, and having written this book here was just deeply meaningful to me.
Congratulations, Sally.